Okay, everybody. I'm Julie Divola. I used to be president of the American Tax Policy Institute, and I'll just say a word about them since I'm passionate about it. The American Tax Policy Institute, as Bridget mentioned, brings together economists and tax lawyers, but also, really has a focus on the intersection of tax and social justice. And to me, climate change is very much about social justice. People talk about the regressivity of a carbon tax, but you think about extreme climate events and who gets impacted by those. And it's not an equal opportunity uh, event. So I think this is super important. This and we are extremely lucky to have Kimberly Clausen to be our keynote speaker, very sought after speaker. And in fact, I just was listening to something, an Ezra Klein podcast, where Dr. Clausen was talking. Dr. Clausen is the Eric M. Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, School of Law. And she, before that, she was at the Department of the Treasury as their lead economist, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis. But before that, she was teaching economics. And I think that as an economist, every law school should have an economist teaching tax law because it's so fundamentally important to it. I mean, so are tax lawyers, but I think, you need both for tax policy. And Dr. Clausen's research examines how government decisions and corporate behavior intersect in the global economy. And that's, of course, is super important for this particular topic. She was author of the book, Open, The Progressive Case for Free Trade, Immigration, and Global Capital. So that will help you also understand why she's so sought after right now. I just want to say she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She also has done economic policy research at the International Monetary Fund, the Hamilton Project, the Brookings Institution, the Tax Policy Center, and the Center for American Progress. And if you haven't read their readings or listened to the podcasts of many of those organizations, you ought to, because they really have some eye-opening findings. And she's talked before Congress many, many times. I could go on, but I actually want to give her time to speak. So just thank her again for being here.
Thanks for that very generous introduction, Julie, and thanks to the conference organizers for putting this together. It's really an impressive set of people, and I feel really honored to be speaking here today and to be part of this important conversation. So my talk focuses on international climate cooperation after 2024. And as an American myself, I think 2024 is an important turning point for US climate policy, in particular the end of the year. But I'm going to focus more positively on ways forward, and in particular ways forward for the rest of the world on climate cooperation, with the hope that the United States will eventually rejoin these efforts. So that's the kind of the goal for today. One thing to remember, of course, with climate change, and everyone in this room is more than aware, that it's a global problem and it's a global collective action problem, and you can't really solve it unless you bring together the world. Even China, which has, approaching 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, even if they had the perfect policy, they're still only 3/10 of the world. They're not all of the world. And the United States and the European Union and India are all large, but even if we did the perfect thing, it wouldn't be enough. Now, you might say, well, this makes things even more daunting because that implies you have to get all the countries in the world to do good things. And that's not necessarily true either. If you look at the G20 countries, which are the largest countries in the world together, they're about 80% of global emissions. So if you could get the G20 on the right track, you only have to negotiate with 20 instead of 100 and some. But two, you get most of the way there. And so I'm going to have a proposal toward the end today that will sort of talk about that as a way forward. Um, so how are we doing? I mean, I think everybody in this room again knows that there's reason for short-term pessimism. We haven't seen sort of the peak of emissions so far. We have seen climate outcomes that look increasingly discouraging. There are some kind of uh, concerns about tipping points and moments of no return with respect to ocean currents and ice caps and the like that, when one stops to look at it too carefully, it's rather frightening. And if you also look kind of just at some of the lived experience, here in the United States, you see it with the floods in Appalachia over the last year. You see it with the fires in the West over the past year. And just the sort of increasing billion-dollar natural disaster trajectory. Now, of course, there have been natural disasters all along, but if you look at the pattern of that, it doesn't look all that different from the pattern of some of the temperatures, right? So it does lead one to think that this isn't completely independent of climate change. Now, there's some divergent paths forward. I think Europe has made enormous progress in reducing emissions. I think, as we heard in the first panel today, the United States has made some progress there as well. But there's a pattern of increasing emissions in much of the rest of the world, and so that's one real challenge. I think there's also encouraging news there. If you look at the investments that China has made in green energy, which has been an important part of their economic growth, as this graph on the right indicates, but also all of their investment in recent years has kind of focused on clean energy. You see that really paying dividends in the ability to make these transformative technologies in a more economical way that should benefit the entire world because China is a major exporting powerhouse. So there's reasons for optimism as well as pessimism. Now, just to sort of set the context of in terms of why I don't anticipate that the United States is going to be a very important leader in the next few years, we have, of course, the Trump administration who's withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. You also see in this graph some work that I did joint with Neil this morning and a handful of others, looking at the difference between US emissions trajectories under different scenarios. And even with IRA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and with the regulatory changes of the Biden administration, we weren't going to meet even our prior Paris goals. The new Paris goals that were just released at the end of the Biden administration are even more ambitious than the ones I've got on this slide. And so those look even further away. But of course, there's already been massive regulatory rollback, as we've seen in recent days and weeks out of the Trump administration, not just the tailpipe and clean electricity regulations, but even other environmental regulations beyond that have been rolled back. And there's some real questions about whether the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits will continue. One thing that you'll notice, while JCT underestimated their cost originally relative to what many others think it would be, JCT has since revised their costs. What that means is that there's this big juicy $700 billion that one could use over a period of 10 years to finance things like Republican tax cuts. And they may find that it's just too tempting to repeal those and get that $700 billion. And that's something to watch over the coming months, is there's this real math problem that they have with respect to the number of tax cuts that they want to do, which includes not just the $5.5 trillion it would cost to fully extend Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as reverse the business razors that are built into that legislation, but also just this long litany of other tax cuts that are desired. No taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security. Perhaps we should not have the income tax at all for people under 150,000. So you hear these very speculative desires to dramatically cut taxes, and the two things that they really have to pay for that are getting rid of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, which would give them a chunk, tariffs, which I think are problematic for other reasons that I won't have time to go into today. And they could find some spending cuts, but I think they're going to find that the spending cuts are really politically difficult as well. Right. So what does that mean for US climate action? You'll notice the red line, while not as optimistic as the blue line or the green line, which is what would happen with a very modest carbon fee, which is, I think, kind of a nice addition to look at. The red line still goes down. Why does it still go down? Well, there's some benefits from US state action, including my new home state of California. There is some benefits from technological change, which I think we do have reasons to be optimistic about that. And then prior policies do have a lasting impact, right? And so we'll see some benefits from that. But really, this is a global problem, and so we have to look at global solutions. So the key challenge here is really a free rider problem. Each country has too little incentive to handle the climate actions on their own because they face the full cost of the mitigation, but the benefit goes to the entire world. So this isn't a difficult problem. It's always going to be a difficult problem, but it's a little more difficult now in part because geopolitical tensions are pretty high, as is nationalist sentiment. And so I think, the United States is kind of leading in those dimensions right now in terms of creating tension and nationalism. But it's not alone. There are other countries that have also kind of said, well, maybe we should be Argentina first, or, fill in the country blank. And so the hope is, one could push back against that ascendant nationalism. But one thing that international agreements really need is better incentives. And so I'm going to sort of talk today about how we might get better incentives, because Paris is very much a voluntary thing. You put in your national contribution. You may or may not have an ambitious one. You may or may not meet it with your actual policy. So what we really need are some carrots and sticks that look more like incentives for governments to do big things. To do that, we're going to need to address two kind of issues. One is equity issues, and there are equity issues within countries and between countries. The between country one is that this is kind of a problem that was created by rich countries. So countries that aren't rich countries might be like, why are you asking us to do things so that we can access your markets, or what have you, right? So we've got that kind of international equity issue. But also there's this persistent problem that many climate policies are viewed as possibly regressive. Now, I think in the context of the larger picture, this regressivity issue is actually a pretty easy one to deal with. When you look at the sort of costs that are imposed by good climate policy, they would be very easy to undo with other tax policies. But that still remains a hurdle. But I think one of the bigger hurdles, and really in terms of moving forward with international alignment and collective action, is that the policy tools themselves are sometimes not well aligned, and that can create some difficulties. So in some work I did with Catherine Wolfram, who was also at Treasury with Neil and I in the early Biden period, we noticed that there were some kind of tensions between the United States and Europe around climate policy. While both of the United States and Europe thought climate change was a thing and wanted to do things about it, we sometimes just kind of came to loggerheads about how to handle these problems. And I say we, but I don't really mean Treasury per se. I mean like the US government position writ large versus the European Union government position writ large. So one example was there was this global agreement, or there was meant to be a so-called global, so-called agreement on sustainable steel and aluminum. And the Americans kind of came to the Europeans and said, hey, we're both clean, we're both ambitious. Let's together do tariffs on other people like China. And Europe was like, no, we have this very carefully thought out rules-based version thing that we're doing. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. You don't have anything to adjust for. Like, you're handing money to your firms. Like, why should we have the same tariff that you have? Right. So the United States was sort of thinking about the columns here. Some countries are highly ambitious, some are not as highly ambitious. Maybe the highly ambitious ones should get together. And the EU is sort of thinking about the rows here, like some countries impose costs, some alleviate costs. And therefore, we need the border adjustments not to punish those who aren't ambitious, but to undo these self-imposed cost distortions that we inflict on our own firms when we do things like carbon pricing, right? So that tension was never really adequately resolved, because any instrument, any carbon tariff or carbon border adjustment or club can really only handle either columns or rows unless countries are pursuing the same approach. If everybody aligns around pricing, right, then one instrument can solve both ambition and competitiveness. But if some countries are subsidizing and some are pricing, you're not going to have one instrument on border adjustments that can really handle both of these types of policy spillovers. And both of them are important, right? Like, you benefit other countries when you do ambitious policies, even if they're subsidizing, but you don't necessarily have the same perspective on competitiveness as your peer countries that might be pricing. So, I think fundamentally the pricing strategy, as opposed to encouraging everybody to subsidize like crazy, is more fundamentally sound for a bunch of reasons. But one is a fiscal one. There's not a lot of fiscal space out there in the world, and there's a lot of things to spend money on. Subsidies are expensive. Sometimes they're inefficient. Pricing, we think, kind of works pretty well. So if we could kind of align around pricing, that might be a more promising way forward. And you might say, well, that's kind of unrealistic, but there's been huge progress over the last decade with many countries that had previously not considered carbon pricing, or who had done relatively meek versions thereof, doing much more serious versions. Right. So at present, we've got about 24% of global emissions covered by carbon pricing. That's not bad. If you look at the OECD and you exclude a certain country, let's call it the United States, the rest of the OECD has over half of their emissions covered by some form of carbon price. So that's like a seriously good place to start. If you look at the G20, which again, at the beginning of the talk, I pointed out they're 80% of world emissions, 17, all but, interestingly, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, right? Everyone else has some form of carbon pricing. India and Brazil are implementing right now, but are moving in that direction. So there actually kind of is a pretty hopeful starting point aligning around carbon pricing. And you can see in this graph, in this map, the World Bank's charting of progress in this area. So how do we get even more countries to carbon price, and what are the consequences of that? Well, first I would point out that the consequences are dramatic. Carbon pricing can be a very effective way to reduce emissions. These figures are from a study of 3 IMF economists, Ian Parry, Simon Black, and Rofe. And they look at kind of like, how much emissions reductions do you need to hit various targets? And what would you achieve if you only got, say, 6 jurisdictions or all the G20 to agree on a minimum carbon price? And you can achieve a lot, right? With not that many countries. So that's a really hopeful thing. And if you compare that to the NDC only approach, right, you're getting much more progress out of minimum carbon pricing. And they have the idea here too that you might be able to vary the minimum in a way that would be sensitive to the needs of poor countries. So within the Paris Accord and international climate negotiations in general, there's this recognition that there should be common but differentiated responsibilities, that you can't ask Mozambique to do the same thing that you can ask Denmark to do, because this isn't Mozambique's fault, and they're much poorer, right? So it doesn't really make sense to ask for the exact same policy instruments. So they just took as one possibility, like a tiered carbon pricing approach, where you ask $25 for the poor countries, 50 for middle income, and 75 for high income countries. And that tiered approach does almost as well as a uniform approach. And so that also suggests a way that you might be able to bring more countries to the table. It's not easy, right? There's some difficulties around the tiers because rich countries aren't always nice. They're not always like, well, of course we should do more. Like it really depends on the situation. But you kind of want to sort of look towards mechanisms that might lead to broad acceptance. And as we saw earlier today in Neil's work and others, it's certainly the case that carbon pricing can keep abatement costs low, which is another reason to kind of look in that direction. So I think the European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism, which also we heard more about earlier today, is kind of an interesting first step in this regard. So if you look at the EU CBAM, it really only covers a small number of sectors: cement, electricity, fertilizers, aluminum, iron, and steel. And when I first saw that list, I was like, well, that's not a very big deal. But then I like looked through a footnote in the EU study, and they were like, this is more than half of industrial emissions. And then I looked with some RAs and a co-author recently at how much just these industries account for in terms of global emissions. And if you include both scope 1 and scope 2, which the EU CBAM doesn't, they just are starting with scope 1. But if you include also the electricity used to make these products only, you're at 20% of world emissions. So that's like a pretty big share of world emissions that are in these industries. And so this EU CBAM is a really kind of an important first step forward, even if they're starting just with scope 1. One thing that one can commend the Europeans for is it's a highly rules-based, non-discriminatory approach. I realize that some countries have um, objected to the idea of this as sort of a regulatory colonialism or something along those lines, right? You hear those words. But think a little bit about what Europe's doing. As they are phasing out the free allowances in their system, they're imposing costs on their own firms, right? And they're simply saying that if you want to serve the European market, you know, pay those costs too. They're not imposing, what they would do, what another country would do for their domestic sales. They're saying if you come and sell into the European market, you have to face the same costs that our firms do. So it's really kind of a releveling of a playing field that Europe would otherwise be skewing against themselves, right? It's really not a tariff in a traditional sense. That's why we call it an adjustment mechanism, right? Not a tariff. Right. And this is sort of like the VAT, by the way, and this is going to come up on April 2nd. You heard it here. But the US government currently seems to think that a VAT is like a tariff, and it's not, because it too is just applying the same thing to foreign products coming into a VAT jurisdiction as they would apply to domestic products. It's a level playing field. So the previous literature has found some negative effects from the EU CBAM on poorer countries, but that literature actually is pretty speculative and is mostly based on, rough guesses of impacts. So they'll say things like, okay, it looks like Mozambique exports a lot of aluminum. They export a lot of aluminum to Europe. It's about this much of their GDP. If they have to pay an extra price of this much, it'll be bad for them. But one thing you need to realize, or some recent work that I've done realizes, is that when Europe phases out those free allowances, the price of aluminum goes up in Europe, right? So if you're Mozambique and you're sending aluminum to Europe, you get an extra price premium for sending it there. It's true, you might have to pay a tariff. It turns out, actually, across the world in aluminum, poor countries don't have higher emissions intensities than rich countries do in aluminum. It's kind of an interesting empirical fact. I've got data now with my co-authors on every aluminum smelter on the planet. And there's not a correlation between GDP per capita and emissions intensity. And Mozambique is actually a little lower than average. And the CBAM on net has the potential to perhaps even raise producer surplus for the Mozambique producer, because by being slightly cleaner than average and the European price going up, right? They may actually benefit from selling to the European market. Now imagine the Mozambique government also does an aluminum only carbon price, right? That would be enough to turn off the tariff from Europe if they do it at the same price. And they would turn that tariff revenue into Mozambique government revenue. So now they get the higher price for selling to Europe. They get revenue, right? They could use that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing for the rest of the world, but it does require like a lot of nuance and understanding there. But it's kind of a nice first step for sort of thinking about how we might align policy initiatives abroad. This is from a policy brief that I did with some co-authors where we sort of look at this extra increase in carbon pricing initiatives under consideration. And we've also got the vertical lines here about EU CBAM announcements, because we've noticed in some of the news stories, and here's a count of news stories, there's sort of an acceleration in discussions around the EU CBAM and around carbon pricing, in part because people sort of view this as another reason to think about carbon pricing, right? So if we think about the dynamic here, imagine a country is just sort of indifferent about whether it might be able to do carbon pricing. You know, like they're just like, maybe we could do it. We're not sure. There's domestic opposition. If they can like blame it on somebody else, they're like, oh, we have to do this because otherwise we'll lose access to the European market. That's yet another reason to do it, right? It's kind of gives you an external scapegoat. But there's also real economic benefits to doing it. Like in the Mozambique example, right? You can convert tariff revenue abroad into domestic revenue at home. You can drive emissions reductions in a highly cost-efficient, low abatement cost way. And you can avoid domestic competitiveness effects at home if you do your own CBAMs as well. Like Australia is considering doing a CBAM now, Canada. Despite this sad news that we heard about earlier today about the consumer-facing carbon policies, they're keeping their industrial carbon policies, and those reach the electricity sector and all those CBAM sectors too. So imagine if they also add a carbon border adjustment, right? They have some of these benefits of being able to say to their domestic firms, like, listen, we're not going to disadvantage you relative to firms in other countries. And I think that's helpful. Further, you can tell your domestic firms, if it's true, that if they're clean firms, that they might actually be better off in terms of an international competitiveness scenario with carbon pricing and a border adjustment than without, right? Because with carbon pricing and a border adjustment, the cleaner firms have a competitive advantage relative to the dirty firms, right? So this provides like an incentive for each country to have the cleaner firms, right? It kind of, if you move in this direction, because they will have competitiveness benefits from that, right? So there's all these kind of interesting political economy dynamics that are unfolding around this EU policy. And some countries, including Thailand and Indonesia, Turkey, Ukraine, and others, have really cited the EU as a reason to kind of think more about carbon pricing. But there's some cautions here as well, right? You can't put on a border adjustment if there's nothing to adjust for, as much as some might want to. I'm trying to avoid naming names at this moment. But you know, a carbon tariff is just a carbon tariff. Like if we tariff dirty stuff from other countries without imposing a cost on our own firms, like maybe that's a little better than tariffing clean stuff from other countries. But you know, I'm not even sure that's true, because if you sort of look at general equilibrium models of what happens if you put on like a carbon tariff in the United States absent a domestic price, and Kyle Mang and his co-authors have a nice piece on this. We actually see US emissions going up, and the countries that kind of get hurt tend to be people that we at least traditionally thought of as our friends. So it's a little more nuanced a policy than you might think. But I think it's important to do these sorts of policies in a more rules-based, non-discriminatory way, and not just use it as an excuse to put on tariffs. And I think it would be dangerous, I think, even for Democrats and those who care about the climate, to sort of say, okay, well, maybe at least let's at least do tariffs in the name of the climate, right? Because I've heard actually some people who I very much respect think that like, okay, maybe the best we can get out of Republicans is carbon tariffs. But you have to think like one step past. Like, let's say we could get carbon tariffs out of Republicans. What does this do to the efforts in the EU and Canada and Australia and elsewhere around their very carefully designed system? If we've got rogue nations coming in and saying that what they're doing is the same and it's not, right? It does have the potential to unravel some of the better efforts abroad, much like a subsidies race could do so as well, right? So I think that one should at least be cautious about that. Plus, if you're kind of thinking about maybe we could do good policy, say in 5 years, let's say you're one of those optimistic people, which I sometimes am. Um, do you really want to do the like kind of bad version now? Like, doesn't it make it harder, for instance, to give your dirty firms or emissions intensive firms the protection without asking them to pay for anything? It's sort of like giving your kids dessert and then being like, later we're going to have spinach. Like that doesn't always work out, right? So if you give all the goodies first, I'm not sure that enables better policy down the road if we think of protection as goodies, right? So a second big question around this tool, aside from dealing with protectionism in disguise, is how to handle the needs of poor countries. I do think there's promise here associated with a tiered structure. Now, it's going to require a certain amount of compromise, right? So you could imagine saying, okay, if Mozambique's poor, maybe a $25 carbon price is enough to turn off the CBAM for them. And if India's in between, maybe $50 is enough, right? But of course, that's not perfect theoretically, right? Like they're going to then have a increased incentive to have the dirty industries there. There's still going to be leakage there, right? And the people in the high price jurisdictions, those firms are still going to feel competitively disadvantaged. So one possible sweet spot might be to have these lower prices phase out over time, to sort of say like, over a period of X years, right? Your low price becomes uniform with the rest of the world. The nice thing about having that trajectory of prices is it keeps the long-term price signals the same, right? Because there's no reason to 30 years from now to have all of the, countries that are poor, embrace dirty technologies because they think their price is permanently going to be lower, right? Because they'd see that trajectory of price increases over time. So that might be one way to sort of get to compromise here too. Another way would be to say, forget the tiered prices, but let's do things more along the lines of paired carrots, where you're like, okay, we're going to use the carbon border adjustment mechanism revenue to directly transfer to poor countries in the group, or we're going to have accompanying free trade in clean energy products, or free trade in other sectors too. Or we're going to provide climate finance or technical assistance or technological transfer. Like there's a lot of other tools that you could put into some sort of agreement. So I have a proposal now with Catherine Wolfram and Dustin Tingley and Joe Aldi, where we suggest like a useful starting point might be to just make a coalition, we're calling it, rather than a club, because clubs sound a little like exclusive. Like coalition sounds more like, good. So we're going to make a coalition of the willing around, nothing, nothing to do with conquest, just a coalition of the willing around heavy industry carbon pricing, right? Start with the CBAM sectors, recognizing that those sectors alone are 20% of global emissions. Use graduated carbon prices, but consider phasing them out over time so that prices eventually converge. Look at both scope 1 and scope 2. And I think actually that's to the advantage of the poorer countries in the world to include scope 2, because they have a lot of potential for clean energy production and electricity that would fuel these sectors as well. And of course, to combine the sticks and the carrots, right? To say, if you join this climate coalition, whether you're Mozambique or South Africa or whatever, you also get resources, you get technological transfer, You get a commitment to free trade in clean energy inputs, for as an example, right? And there's been a lot of concern about the weaponization of trade um, for critical minerals and the like, right? So imagine if China is part of this coalition, right? One of their agreements would be like, we agree not to weaponize these inputs, right? And to make sure that you have access to them, right? And there'd be a way to, show leadership and soft power at this moment that there's kind of a vacuum in that regard with respect to at least the United States. So for the G17, we do simulations that suggest if this went forward, you could expect worldwide emissions to go down by about 1.5%, which is significant, right? If you compare it to like what we'd get out of the Inflation Reduction Act, or if you look over the past decade at carbon emissions reductions in the EU or the United States, those are actually smaller than what you'd get from a heavy industry climate club, as we've described, just among the G17. So excluding the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, but the rest of the G20. One little footnote, the African Union is now in the G20, so it's technically the G21, although we're still calling it the G20. I'm not including the African Union as a group, because that's like a lot of countries. So I'm focusing on 17 of the original 20, if that makes sense. If this were to expand to the world, right, you could get even further. You could get 10%. And I would point out that there's also a lot of tax administration benefits associated with a coordinated approach here. Right now, we've got the EU doing one thing. The UK is going to have their own carbon border adjustment mechanism, not exactly the same. Australia's got another one in the works that they're thinking about. You could imagine, well, the United States might do their own thing someday. Like it would make more sense if countries could agree on some common elements. Not everything would have to be common, like, countries will have their own ways of doing things, but take issues like measurement and reporting. Wouldn't it be great if you were a producer and you could kind of certify in some internationally recognized way, like what is the emission content of your output? And then all the countries in the world would be like, yeah, that fits our scientific board's consensus about, measurement, right? And so I think the administrative benefits here are potentially quite large. One of the things that the European Union has recently done is recognize that they can get 99% of the emissions benefits from their policies by only applying it to 10% of their taxpayers. Because a lot of the little guys aren't really doing that much emitting, but still have to fill out the 30-page form or whatever, like it's so that's another thing to think carefully about. Like it turns out the world economy is pretty concentrated in the hands of a smaller number of business players. And that's really, that small number of business players is really where all of the action is. It's where all the tax base is. The corporate tax base is incredibly concentrated. It's where all the emissions are, right? So you don't necessarily have to apply these regulations to absolutely everybody. And that would be another thing that we could coordinate around. So, this may seem like a weird time to suggest like an international effort, because especially standing here in the United States, it may not seem super optimistic for that kind of thing. But bear in mind, the United States is a small part of the world. And in a way, we've been holding back to some extent other countries' ability to focus only on pricing, because we've often been showing up at these places and being like, well, pricing doesn't work for us, but other stuff we might be able to do, right? So if the United States is out of the picture, right, it might be easier for the rest of the world to coalesce around pricing, right? And even if this doesn't happen right away, I do think it's really useful for people to start laying the groundwork for these types of things. Sometimes it takes decades to get to good policy, but you can kind of get there eventually if you sort of work on that. And there's the opportunity of Brazil hosting the next big COP. They're very interested in this kind of thing, and so that might be another way to act. So I'm going to conclude with this slide that'll look really kind of different from some of the others, because it's about the international tax agreement. But I actually think there's some really interesting lessons from the international tax agreement that could apply to this moment in climate change. So for a long time, really for decades, and still at present, there's this problem of a race to the bottom in corporate taxation, where countries have a prisoner's dilemma sort of rationale for lowering and lowering and lowering the corporate's profits tax, because they're worried about losing tax base to other countries, right? And in addition to that sort of race to the bottom dynamic, there's this problem of profit shifting, that even if you have a higher corporate tax rate, right, your firms will have the legal and accounting expertise to move the profits to lower tax jurisdictions. In fact, I now get to teach a whole class on how one does that, which is depressing. I try to include sections of the class on like why you should feel bad about doing it. But because I personally think the corporate tax has the potential, with just minor tweaks, to be quite an efficient tax, because it's falling on above normal profits, which there's a huge overlap between the current corporate tax base and one on excess profits. It's actually a pretty efficient tax. But over a period of decades, countries came to realize that this is kind of a problem, right? And so they recognized the problem. They saw having fair tax systems as something that had broad social benefits. They were willing to take actually kind of unbelievably transformative changes to the international tax system, to change who has the right to tax, to change what is the minimum rate in a global sense, like this idea that there should be a global minimum rate. And they had an enforcement mechanism built into the agreement. So if you look at this map, you'll see that some countries, the light blue ones, have adopted the international tax agreement. And that doesn't really seem like the entire world, but it's enough to reach well over 90% of multinational income, because multinationals operate throughout the world. So as soon as you operate in one of those adopting countries, you're kind of in the scope of this agreement. And it comes with an enforcement mechanism. And the enforcement mechanism is like, let's say you're a US multinational, you want to operate in Europe. Europe might worry that you would then shift income out of the European tax base because you're not an adopting country, right? So they have something called this undertaxed profits rule, which basically allows the adopting jurisdictions to top up the taxes of companies that want to operate in their markets. To me, that sounds a lot like a CBAM, in the sense that what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is doing is saying like, hey, if you want to serve our market, you have to meet some minimum carbon price, right? This is like, if you want to serve our market, you have to meet some minimum corporate tax. But that enforcement mechanism itself is what got over 135 countries to sign on to this international agreement, which now covers, over 90% of multinational income. So, I think that that's a nice example of how countries can work together and move forward to address this problem, and hopefully something similar can happen with respect to climate. So I'll leave it at that.